It was the spring of 1964, and the Chitlin Circuit was burning. Every night, in cities across the American South and up through the Midwest, there were theaters and ballrooms packed with black audiences hungry for soul, hungry for rhythm and blues, hungry for the kind of music that felt like God himself had reached down and plucked a nerve inside your chest. And on that circuit, there was one man who sat at the very top of the mountain, one man who every other singer measured himself against. His name was Jackie Wilson, and he was not a man who shared the spotlight. Jackie Wilson was 30 years old in 1964, and he had already done things with his voice that most people believed were simply impossible. He could start a note low and quiet, barely a whisper, and then climb it so high and so fast that women in the front rows would grab each other's arms just to stay standing. He had recorded one hit after another, and when he walked out onto a stage, the audience didn't just cheer. They shook. They wept. They screamed his name like a prayer. Jackie Wilson wasn't just a performer. He was an event. He was a force of nature wearing a tailored suit, and everyone in the music business knew it. So when a young promoter named Harold Logan started putting together a soul review for a series of Chicago dates in the fall of 1964, he knew he needed Jackie Wilson to headline. No Jackie, no show. That was simply how it worked. Harold spent 2 weeks negotiating the deal, agreed to Jackie's terms, agreed to his dressing room requirements, agreed to the lighting setup he demanded, and then, with Jackie's signature secured, Harold turned his attention to filling out the rest of the bill. That is, when he found Otis Redding. Otis was 22 years old that fall, and outside of Georgia and a handful of southern cities, almost nobody knew his name. He had released a single the previous year called These Arms of Mine on a small label out of Memphis called Volt, a subsidiary of Stax Records. The song had done well enough on the rhythm and blues charts that people in the industry were starting to pay attention. But well enough and famous were not the same thing. Otis Redding in 1964 was still a young man from Macon, Georgia, who grew up singing in church, who had learned to perform by watching Little Richard tear up every stage he stood on, who worked odd jobs to help support his family while chasing a dream that most people around him thought was probably too large for a kid like him. But Harold Logan had seen Otis perform. He had driven down to a small club in Atlanta 4 months earlier, taken a seat in the back, and watched this young man in a borrowed suit walk up to a microphone and proceed to leave every single person in that room completely speechless. It wasn't just the voice, though the voice was extraordinary, raw and aching, and full of something that went beyond technique, beyond training. It was the way Otis seemed to mean every syllable. It was the way his body was involved in the music, the way he moved as though the song was happening to him in real time, as though he was feeling the emotion not as a performer, but as a human being caught in the grip of something overwhelming. Harold had walked out of that Atlanta club knowing he was looking at something rare, something that only comes along once in a generation, maybe less. So Harold Logan put Otis Redding on the Chicago bill as the opening act, and then Jackie Wilson saw the lineup. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon, 2 weeks before the first Chicago date. Harold was in his office going over logistics when his secretary told him Jackie Wilson was on the line. Harold picked up the phone, already knowing that something had gone sideways. Jackie Wilson's voice was not loud when he was angry. That was the thing about Jackie that people who didn't know him failed to understand. He didn't need to shout. He could say the most devastating things in a tone that was almost conversational, almost gentle, and somehow that made it worse. I looked at the lineup, Harold. Harold said yes, and how are you, Jackie? And Jackie didn't bother with any of that. You put a kid from Georgia on my show. A kid nobody has ever heard of. You want me to follow an amateur." Harold tried to explain. He explained about the Atlanta club, about These Arms of Mine, about the way Otis connected with an audience. Jackie listened without interrupting, which was not a good sign. When Harold finished, there was a pause. Then Jackie said what he said. He said it quietly, with the absolute certainty of a man who had been the best in the room for so long that the idea of being challenged by a 22-year-old from Macon had moved past offense into something that felt almost like pity. "That boy cannot sing. He is rough and unpolished, and he doesn't know what he's doing up there. You put him on before me, and he's going to embarrass himself, embarrass the show, and drag down everything I've built with this audience. I don't share my stage with amateurs, Harold." Harold Logan held the phone and felt the weight of what he was being asked to do. Pulling Otis from the bill would be the easy thing. Jackie was the draw. Jackie was the headliner. There was no business logic to keeping a 22-year-old nobody on a bill that Jackie Wilson was threatening to walk away from. Harold thought about that club in Atlanta. He thought about the silence that had fallen over the room when Otis sang. Not the silence of boredom or confusion, but the silence of people who had stopped breathing, because they were afraid that if they made a sound, they might miss something they would spend the rest of their lives trying to get back to. He kept Otis on the bill. He didn't know, when he made that decision, that he was not just defending one young singer's slot on One Night in Chicago. He didn't know that he was holding open a door that, once opened, would eventually let through a sound that would reshape American music. He just knew what he had seen in that Atlanta club, and he knew that whatever it was, it deserved to be heard. Otis Redding arrived in Chicago on a Thursday evening in late October, traveling by bus, because the label wasn't covering plane tickets for opening acts who hadn't proven themselves yet. He had his guitar. He had 2 sets of performance clothes, one of which he had borrowed. He had a band held together as much by faith as by any real financial arrangement, because none of them were making enough money to justify the hours they were putting in. He had all of this, and he had something else that nobody could see and nobody could measure. The kind of conviction that doesn't come from success or validation or applause. The kind of conviction that comes from somewhere so deep inside a person that it simply isn't connected to the outside world at all. He had heard, through the network of musicians and promoters who talk to each other the way that world always talks, that Jackie Wilson had tried to have him removed from the bill. He had sat with this information on the bus from Memphis to Chicago, watching the flat land roll by outside the window. What he decided, somewhere around the Tennessee-Kentucky state line, was that Jackie Wilson's opinion of him was not information he needed. The only answer to the question of whether Otis Redding could sing would happen on the stage. The first Chicago date was at the Regal Theater on South Parkway, one of the great stages on the Chitlin circuit, a theater with history in its walls, a room that had heard some of the most important music of the 20th century and knew the difference between the real thing and everything else. The audience that filled it that Friday night had come because Jackie Wilson was headlining. They had come dressed in their finest, women in church hats and evening gowns, men in pressed suits and shined shoes. They had come ready to be lifted. Nobody was particularly focused on the opening act. Otis walked out onto the stage of the Regal Theater and took the microphone in his hand, and for just a moment, before the music started, he looked out at the audience, not scanning them, not performing confidence he didn't feel. Just looking. The way you look at something you've been waiting for. Then the band came in, and Otis Redding began to sing. There are moments in music that cannot be fully explained and cannot be fully remembered, only half remembered, the way you half remember a dream. What the people in the Regal Theater that night would try to describe later to their friends and families, and to anyone who would listen, was not a performance so much as an experience, something that happened to them rather than something they watched. They would say things like, "I don't know what it was," or "I couldn't tell you why," and then they would say, "I just know I couldn't move. I just know that something in that room changed." Otis sang these arms of mine first, and the audience that had been chattering and settling in and paying attention to everything, but the stage went quiet within the first 16 bars. Not politely quiet. Not the quiet of an audience being respectful to an opening act. The deep quiet of people who have been stopped in their tracks. He sang it the way he had written it, which was the way he felt it, which is the way a young man feels when he is reaching across an impossible distance toward something he needs and cannot quite touch. His voice broke on certain notes, not because he lacked control, but because control wasn't the point. The point was truth. The point was that when you stood before an audience and gave them something genuinely yours, something you hadn't manufactured or calculated or constructed to please them, they could feel the difference. And what they felt in the Regal Theater that night was that this young man from Macon, Georgia, was not performing a song. He was handing them something real, something that cost him something to give. By the second song, people in the audience were on their feet. By the third song, something was happening in the room that Harold Logan, watching from the back, had only seen a handful of times in his life. A complete and total surrender. An audience that had stopped being an audience and had become something unified. Something caught up together in a current that was bigger than any of them individually. Otis performed for 40 minutes. He was supposed to perform for 20. Nobody in the theater told him to stop. When he finally left the stage, the applause that followed him was not the polite applause of a crowd acknowledging an opening act. It was the kind of applause that has weight to it, that fills a room all the way to the ceiling and then keeps going. Otis stood in the wings and listened to it and felt something he had been chasing his entire life without ever quite being able to name it. He felt recognized. Not by his name, not by his history, not by any credential or achievement or approval from anyone in the industry. Recognized by the music itself. Recognized by the simple fact that he had given something true, and the room had received it. Jackie Wilson was waiting in the wings on the other side of the stage. What happened next depends on who is telling the story, and the people who were there that night have told it many ways over the years. But the version that has survived, the version the people closest to both men have consistently returned to, is this. Jackie Wilson watched Otis Redding walk off that stage and heard what the Regal Theater was saying to the young man from Georgia, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. Jackie Wilson, who had an opinion about everything, who had spoken with absolute certainty about this kid from Georgia not being able to sing, who had called Harold Logan on a Tuesday afternoon and tried to have him removed from the bill, stood in the wings of the Regal Theater and said nothing. Then he walked over to where Otis was standing. The two men looked at each other. Otis was still breathing hard from the performance, still coming down from whatever it is that performers come down from when they have given everything and left nothing on the stage. Jackie Wilson was wearing his stage suit, about to go out and do what he had been doing for the better part of a decade, about to do it for an audience that had just been handed something from a young man whose name most of them hadn't known an hour ago. Jackie Wilson extended his hand. He said, "I was wrong about you." That was all he said. But in that world, in that moment, between those two men, it was everything. What nobody knew that evening, not Jackie Wilson and not Harold Logan and not Otis himself, was that there were only 3 more years. 3 more years of that voice, and that presence and that specific and irreplaceable way of giving everything every single time. 3 more years before a December morning in Wisconsin that would take Otis Redding away from the world he had been building. Away from the music he had been making, away from the audience that had finally found him. But the 3 years that remained after that Chicago night would be the 3 years that changed everything. After Chicago, Otis Redding was not the same unknown young man he had been when he stepped off the bus from Memphis. Word traveled the way word travels in music, person to person, city to city. People who had been at the Regal Theater told people who hadn't been there. Promoters called Harold Logan. The label started paying attention in a different way. Otis went back into the studio at Stax with a new urgency, with the particular energy of a man who has been validated not by critics or by charts, but by the only validation that matters in music, which is an audience in a room surrendering completely. He recorded Mr. Pitiful and Chained and Bound, and a string of songs that found their way onto rhythm and blues charts and into the consciousness of an audience that was growing steadily larger. He toured constantly, sometimes doing 200 shows a year, performing with an intensity that people who saw it regularly still found astonishing, because you expected it to diminish, and it never did. He was building something. Not just a career, not just a catalog of songs, but a version of soul music that hadn't existed before him, a version that took the gospel fervor he had grown up with in the church and combined it with something rawer and more secular and more urgently human. A version that was reaching toward something universal, something that would eventually cross every boundary the music industry had erected between its audiences. The summer of 1967 was the summer that showed him how far it could reach. The Monterey International Pop Festival in June of 1967 was not a rhythm and blues event. It was a gathering of the counterculture, of the rock and roll generation, of the flower children and the experimental musicians, and the long-haired audiences of hate. Ashbury and the Sunset Strip. He stood backstage at Monterey and looked at the audience and saw something he had not been prepared for. 40,000 people who were not the audience he had spent his career building. He picked up his guitar. He walked out onto the stage. And then he did what Otis Redding had always done, the only thing he knew how to do, the only thing he had ever done that worked. He gave them everything. He held nothing back, reserved nothing for a more receptive room. He gave these strangers the same thing he had given the congregation at the Regal Theater, the same thing he had given every audience in every city in every year that he had been doing this. He gave them the truth of himself. Shake came first, a full-body demand that the crowd give themselves over to the music, and the crowd responded before they had fully processed what was happening to them. Then try a little tenderness, which began slowly, almost quietly, and then built in the particular way that Otis had always known how to build a song, climbing through registers of feeling, you adding intensity the way you add pressure to something you intend to break open. Oh, until he was screaming the final bars in a voice that sounded like it was costing him something profound to produce. 40,000 people who had come for other music discovered what Otis Redding was. He was no longer a regional phenomenon, no longer a rhythm and blues act with a loyal following. He was, in the space of 40 minutes, something new, something larger. Oh, a voice that had found its full audience at last. He said to the crowd before he left the stage that he had been told they were the love crowd. He said he wanted to say something to them, and what he said was one of the simplest sentences a performer can say to an audience. He said, "I love you." He meant it. He always meant it. 4 months after Monterey, Otis Redding was sitting on a dock in Sausalito, California. The sun was going down over the bay, and the water was moving in small, slow rhythms, reflecting back the light in pieces. He had a notepad and a pen. He was tired in the way that a man gets tired when he has been on the road for most of 3 years, when he has given himself completely to an audience night after night, and has begun to feel the weight of that giving in his body. He watched the water. He wrote down words. The song came quickly, the way the songs that matter most often come, not built piece by piece, but arriving more or less whole, as though they had been waiting somewhere just outside reach and had finally found the door. Steve Cropper helped him finish it, worked on the structure and the arrangement. But the feeling at the center, the specific aching quality of a man who has been everywhere and is tired of moving, who has arrived at a place of stillness and found in that stillness something that feels simultaneously like peace and like loss, that came from Otis alone, from the dock, from the water, from whatever was moving through him that afternoon in California. Sitting on the dock of the bay was recorded in December of 1967 at Stax in Memphis. Otis listened to the playback and told the people around him it felt different from anything he had recorded before. Quieter, more certain, like a man who has finally stopped arguing with himself about something. He whistled the outro himself, an improvisational moment kept in the final recording, because it was exactly right. Because nothing else could have ended that song except a man simply being present, simply existing, simply being alive in a moment without any demand that the moment be more than it was. He never heard it on the radio. On December 10, 1967, 3 days after the final recording session, a plane went down over Lake Monona in Wisconsin. Otis Redding was 26 years old. Sitting on the dock of the bay was released 6 weeks later. It went to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100, becoming the first posthumous number 1 single in the history of that chart. The world that had been slow to find Otis Redding rushed toward him now, the way the world always rushes toward something irreplaceable once it is gone. The song stayed. The songs always stay. Jackie Wilson, who in 1964 had said that boy cannot sing, spent years after Otis died talking about him in the particular way that musicians talk about other musicians who have done something the speaker cannot quite explain and cannot quite get past. He said more than once that Otis Redding had a gift that was different in kind from talent, different from skill, different from what most performers had even on their best nights. He said Otis had the thing that you cannot learn and cannot manufacture, the thing that is either there or it isn't, and when it's there, every other person in the room knows it without being told. Harold Logan, the promoter who had kept Otis on the Chicago bill despite Jackie Wilson's objections, said in an interview years later that he had never second-guessed a professional decision less than that one. Not because it was a smart business move, though it turned out to be, but because some things are simply right in a way that has nothing to do with business. Because sometimes the only honest thing you can do is hold a door open and let something through. What passed through that door in the fall of 1964? What walked out onto the stage of the Regal Theater in Chicago and stopped a room cold was not a career. It was not a product. It was a human being with something to say, something to give, something that had been building inside him since the first time he sang in a church in Macon, Georgia, and felt the congregation move toward him. It was a voice that had been looking for the right room and had finally found one. And when that voice found its room, the room was never the same again. The whistling at the end of Sitting On the dock of the bay lasts for approximately 11 seconds. It is one of the most recognizable musical moments of the 20th century. Fans have described what it does to them when they hear it. The particular mix of peace and sadness that washes over them, the feeling of time slowing down, of something large and simple and true being expressed in a form so modest that it barely seems like music at all. Otis Redding was 26 years old when he whistled it. He had been performing professionally for less than 5 years. He had a wife and children. He had a farm in Georgia that he had bought with the first real money he earned from music, a place he wanted to return to when the road finally allowed him to stop moving. He never stopped moving. But the music stopped for him, and in stopping, became permanent. Became the kind of permanent that only happens when something is taken before it finishes, when the full arc of what a life might have been remains forever out of reach. What Otis Redding might have recorded in the years after sitting on the dock of the bay. What he might have done with an audience that had finally found him. What he might have said, given the time to say it. We have what we have, sitting on the dock of the bay, these arms of mine, try a little tenderness, respect, which he wrote and which Aretha Franklin transformed into an anthem. That is its own kind of legacy, to give a song to the world and watch the world make it larger than you and imagined it could be. We have the story of a Chicago night in 1964 when a young man from Georgia walked out onto a stage and gave an audience everything he had, and an audience that had come for someone else discovered that what they actually needed was standing right in front of them all along. We have the story of Jackie Wilson extending his hand in the wings of the Regal Theater and saying 3 words that cost him something to say, and that told the truth more clearly than any performance either of them had ever given. I was wrong about you. 3 words that recognized, without ceremony and without apology, that greatness is not something you can predict from the outside, not something you can assess from a name on a lineup sheet or a reputation that hasn't been built yet. Greatness is something you witness. And when you witness it, the only honest thing left to do is say so. Otis Redding's voice was a force of nature that existed for 26 years and changed the shape of American music in ways that are still being traced, still being understood, still being felt in the work of every soul singer who came after him and reached for the thing he reached for, which was nothing less than absolute truth in the space between a human being and a song. He sat on a dock in California and listened to the water and wrote down what he heard. Some voices don't go away. They just change address. They move into the music and stay there, alive inside every note, every play, every moment, when someone who never saw him perform and never knew him presses a button and hears a man whistling at the end of a song and feels, without knowing why, as though something true has just been handed to them. That is the gift. That is what it was always about. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear that the voice inside them matters, that the room is waiting, that the door is open. Leave a comment and tell us about the music that changed something in you. And don't forget to ring the notification bell, because these stories deserve to be told, and there are more of them waiting.